Okay, so Immanuel Kant and Soren Kierkegaard, in our Renaissance and Enlightenment philosophers material here, these two guys are less considered connected to anything related to the Renaissance and more sort of very strictly speaking Enlightenment guys. Their work is good, and sometimes it has a lot of really good connection and overlap with Christian thought, with Christian morality and ethics, and some of that kind of material. And sometimes it takes a hard left. And following this can be a bit interesting because they say things in one sentence that sound like somebody else we've talked about, and then they say something, they draw some sort of different or opposite conclusion in the next sentence. And so work with me here as we walk through Kant and Kierkegaard, and remember that there's class discussion to go along with this stuff. And so if you're catching this before the in-class discussion, be patient, stay with the video as it progresses, and then use class time to help clarify. And if you're using this in the reverse order, keep in mind the things we talked about in class first. So off we go with Kant. So Kant is committed to this idea of reason. He recognizes really importantly and really succinctly that the age in which he lives is dominated by reason and the pursuit of reason and all of this. And so he says, listen, we live in the age of reason, and the age of reason needs an age of criticism. Critical thought and the ability to understand what is going on and the implications of the way that life and philosophy and theology have currently been explained needs more critical thought than it's been given. And honestly, he's endeavoring this idea that what we've established by proposing this kind of pure reason thing, it needs to honestly be evaluated for all of its implications. And so that's his starting point. He says reason is sovereign, but reason itself needs to be reasonable. And so the emphasis that he finds on this pure reason, standard of all things, he says that may be a little bit too far. Something else might give boundary to reason. Reason itself actually gives boundaries to reason in the practical exercise of it. And so reason, as a rational exercise, needs to also be exercised rationally. And so he writes what he calls the Critique of Pure Reason, in which he makes this argument. Metaphysics is the domain of reason. And so a lot like John Locke and Aristotle, who argue that, look, we need sensory data and input to draw conclusions and know certain things, Kant would say yes, but at the same time, reason gives us access to abstract ideas, concepts, things that exist that don't necessarily need substance and tangibility and this sensory world experience in order for us to understand that they're real and that they make sense. And so the goal here is that reason can be critiqued by reason itself. Reason should impose rational limitations on itself and its exercise that should establish some kind of secure, consistent foundation for philosophy and science. In other words, science cannot assert what it cannot back by observation. And philosophy has to assert that which cannot be tangible. Philosophy has to begin with things we can know, experience, talk about, etc. However, philosophy is going to draw conclusions on the basis of reason about what most logically, rationally, and clearly explains the issues present in the unknown stuff. Science gives us tools to start the conversations, but some of the most pressing questions we have as human beings exist beyond what science can actually talk to. And so something like this idea that we can have some sort of purely materialistic understanding of the universe is outside of Kant's purview. That is not how he understands the world. He says, actually, we need reason to reach beyond the things that the physical world will talk to us about in order to have a better understanding of how the physical world works. So then, what about this metaphysical stuff? He said, actually, what happens is there are these created intellectual representations based on our sensory experience and knowledge in this realm of existence. In other words, metaphysical is the place where we draw conclusions of any kind of significance. And this sounds very much like Aristotle. We use sensory experience and knowledge in this realm to draw conclusions about why this space is the way that it is, about what has made it so, and about what its purpose is, and some of these kinds of questions that reach beyond the physical realm. But in order for us to answer those questions, we have to start here. It's very Aristotelian. Sensibility and an understanding, sensibility being practical application of the senses to take in information, understanding being the logical process, the rational process that gets us from taking in that input to drawing conclusions about it, create what he calls cognition, which is the what we think, and then the ability to think about what we think. And this kind of leads him into this dialogue where he starts on this train of metaphysics, where the bulk of his thinking here begins to sound really abstract because it's not based in the concrete, tangible, and sensible world. And so he says there are two things here. Number one, there's the metaphysics of nature. This is how things appear to us, and it's based on what they are, but it's how they appear. And so their appearances to us and the construction of the thing and its material components, these are all scientific, and they're restricted to the sensible world around us. They involve our senses. And so we can see the table and its construction. We can touch it. We can smell the wood, perhaps, or whatever the case may be. These things in the sensible world, they clue us into some truth that's deeper, but there is part of that truth that is deeper that seeps into the physical and sensible constructs of the world around us. So people and tables and trees, they are those things in a kind of physical, or in a physical way, in a sensible way, to use his vocabulary, because of what they are beyond the sensible experience. So that's step one. Step two, he says, is the metaphysics of morals. This is what stuff is. This is the essence, the nature. This is the beyond this realm of existence truth. And here, while he's rather Aristotelian in process and in how we talk about these things, this begins to sound a bit like Plato. And it's sort of a merger of the two, to be honest. Things are according to the metaphysics of morals, and that influences the metaphysics of nature that shapes their appearances. So, people are what we are in the metaphysics of morals. That metaphysics of morals influences the metaphysics of nature to sort of shape physically, sensibly, what we are and what we do. This reach into that metaphysical, into the metaphysics of morals, as defining of nature, is exactly opposite. It seems to me, anyway, exactly opposite the scientific determinism we get in David Hume's critique of John Locke. Locke is arguing that knowledge is perception of these things that basically we have to compare and contrast. Kant is arguing that we can know both what science determines to be fact and the facts beyond that determine scientific fact and reality. So Hume says we have to have ideas of the metaphysical in order to know anything, and that, in a lot of ways, seems to be what Kant is talking about here. This division between the metaphysics of nature and the metaphysics of morals means that reality is not just as simple as the physical appearance of these things. Things are not only, as Locke would talk about it, they're atomic constructions. Things are beyond that. Our sensibility and understanding have to work together as they construct the cognition that we have of the world. But what Kant is asserting is that as we put that together, what we're actually doing is understanding that the sensible world conforms to certain fundamental laws that we see metaphysically, so to speak, and then he puts a twist on it. He says, however, that we create these intellectual representations of the metaphysical based on our sensory experience, back to Aristotle. And that creation of these intellectual representations actually means for us that our mind actively constructs the world as we understand it according to the natural laws we see in play. So here's the thing. Science gives us access to the metaphysics of nature. The metaphysics of morals are the things that we talk about that we see governing the metaphysics of nature. Kant's twist on all of this is that those metaphysics of morals aren't observable without us in some way sort of shaping them. So our observation of the nature or essence of things actually begins to sort of like tweak it. And so as we observe what we see, we end up in this place where we're not just understanding, we're actually creating an intellectual framework by which we operate. So then his point about scientific determinism gets down to this. This idea of determinism based on what science tells us. He says does not threaten our traditional morality and authorities because the world of science only applies to the metaphysics of nature. Since the soul and the self and the mind is located in the realm of things that are not in the realm of appearances, we can be free, and that freedom involves two pieces, what he will go on to talk about with the giving of self-law in morality and ethics, and in our intellectual representations of the world around us. So he begins rather Aristotelian, and he sort of maintains that, but there's this twist on it, that as we observe the world around us, we actually start to create the understanding. And for him, then, knowledge is not a passively received thing. Knowledge is an actively created thing. And that, for him, indicates that what science has argued is a kind of determinism for how life operates and for why things are the way that they are. He can distinguish that in the realm of appearance from the truth in the realm of cognition and the metaphysics of morals and these, eventually what he'll talk about is the giving of law to the self, because it takes an intellect outside of the metaphysics of nature to understand the determinism of one thing to the next. It's probably the best I can do with it in a sort of summation style video here. We'll talk about it for sure a lot more when it comes to class time, or we have, depending on when you watch this. But let's go on to Kierkegaard then. Søren Kierkegaard sort of makes a hard left from all of these individuals, and he wants to outline for us how human life operates as he sees it and understands it. And so what he gives us initially is the fact that human life and existence as we can experience it and know it comes to us in 3 stages. And those 3 stages are the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. There are 6 pieces to the aesthetic stage. And before I get into that, each of these stages is progressively better than the other one. So everybody begins in the aesthetic, but nobody should stay there. The ethical is good, but the religious is even better. And this is sort of Kierkegaard's progression. So he says this, the aesthetic stage begins with an immersion in sensory experience. Psychological development of human beings validates some of this and all this kind of stuff. He says basically, when we're immature in the way that we process the world around us, we immerse ourselves in the sensory world of things we can experience by the application of the senses: sight, touch, taste, sound, smell, etc. Eventually, what we do as human people then, though, is we valorize. We turn into great acts of glory and valor, the possible over the actual. The dream over the reality. We talk about what could be or what should be, and we sort of idealize everything instead of dealing with what is actually present. Another manifestation in this aesthetic stage of existence, or another piece to this puzzle in these 6 pieces here, is egotism. We're sort of self-absorbed, and everything is aimed at the self and making the self pleased, content, happy, whatever. Even to the extreme of sort of being hedonistic, so to speak, making the self happy. And then he says there's this fragmentation of the subject of experience. We break down our experiences into the things that we like and the things that we don't like, and we cling to the things that we like and we reject the things that we don't like. And we try and segment it out like that because it helps us, or at least we think it does. We think that it helps us deal with pain and suffering by breaking things down into, well, this is bad and this is good. He says that typically leads us to the next thing, which is a nihilistic wielding of irony and skepticism. So what do? We apply irony and we apply a severe skepticism to the world around us to make meaningless, nihilistic, to make meaningless the stuff that we don't like and that's uncomfortable for us. Effectively, what he's arguing, if we wanted to put it in 21st century vocabulary, the stuff that makes us uncomfortable, or the stuff that we don't like, we make fun of by making it into a meme. And we turn it into this kind of upside down inside joke where really I'm bothered by this stuff, but I'm going to make fun of it because I either don't want to understand it or it makes me uncomfortable or whatever the case may be. And all of this lands us in this place where we're simply wielding our imagination as much as we can in order to not be bored. Whether that's practically and tangibly trying to create experiences for ourselves, or we're sort of living in our virtual worlds, perhaps, or the worlds of our imagination where we just escape this reality to avoid being bored with it because this reality lets you down quite frequently. So the aesthetic stage, to be totally honest, like as a Christian overlap, the aesthetic stage of existence sounds a lot like us in a very selfish, self-motivated, sinful state. Basically, it sounds a lot like Romans chapter 1 and 2. This is how people act under the condition of sin. We try and employ humor and joke, and we try and impose things upon our reality that don't belong here, imagined or infinite or whatever the case may be, in order to entertain ourselves, because otherwise life is boring and it's too much work, effectively. But at some point in time, we run out of the aesthetic stage of existence. And we realize that this isn't it. There has to be more than this. There has to be meaning, because there's no meaning in the aesthetic stage. It's just feeling good. Well, if we then look at and move to the ethical stage of existence, he says there's two pieces to this ethical stage. There's the actual ethics, which he argues are customary mores, and then there is ideal ethics. These higher principles than just this is what's sort of socially normative. Actual are basically rights and wrongs that we have agreed upon. Like, it's customary to shake somebody's hand. In my classes, it's customary that when you come into my room, I greet you with a fist bump. That's a customary thing. There's nothing inherently right or wrong about that, except for the fact that I've said and sort of made you agree, because I'm the benevolent dictator of the classroom, that I greet you with a fist bump. So actual ethics is more like that. And ideal ethics are these higher principles than just the social norms. And they depend on something beyond our social conditions and our interrelatedness within that society. So actual ethics is conditional on these things. Number one, it's necessary for us to choose these things seriously and inwardly. You got to agree to be on board with the program in order for the customary mores to actually apply. Otherwise, it doesn't really matter. It's just something you've said and nobody's listened to. Two, we have to believe that it's good to come into the room and give me a fist bump, and it's bad, and those are actual identifiers of what is true as it relates to what's going on in our classrooms. Three, you have to have choice in the action as a necessary thing. You can choose to not give me a fist bump. It's not customary, and so it's not right, but you should have choice. So I've said, I'll meet you at the door, give you a fist bump. Plenty of people choose on a given day to come in and not do so. Well, okay. On the other hand, those customs that we've established that way, they sort of become the rules, and then we have to live according to those rules. So he argues that, listen, this is a real thing. It's sort of artificial, but it's a real thing. We create it artificially based on our customs, our culture, our environment, our relationship. But they still function as the rules by which we agree to live in this little classroom society. On the other hand, ideal conditions for ideal ethics means that the good and evil we choose is actually dependent upon God and not what is socially determined here. And this is better than actual ethics. These things are essential, but they're essentially existential. They're primarily based upon our experience, especially our experience of God. And they relate directly to the virtues as we experience them in relationship with God and as He plays them out in our lives. So then our task is to be obedient, either willfully or begrudgingly, but just be obedient to what God has asked us to do. And so all of this in ideal ethics has to begin with faith in God. We have to trust that God has defined what is good and evil, not our society. And that we have to necessarily, essentially experience a relationship with God in order to understand those rights and wrongs. Because it's only in the context of that relationship with God that the virtues become related to us as God plays them out. And then we become obedient to God in playing out those virtues around us. And this, he says, honestly, when you get to this point where you are willfully obedient and looking to God as defining of all of this stuff, it leads us to the next thing, which is the religious stage of existence. And he says this is where faith is everything that it's supposed to be. But his argument is that faith is actually the expression of the self. The truest self that we can have is expressed in faith. The definition of what we are as persons is expressed in faith. Our choices are the habit of our faith. And it is the most defining thing about our lives, our faith. Sounds very much like James, faith without works is dead. Kierkegaard is arguing that our habit demonstrates our faith. Our habit demonstrates our faith. All right. What does that mean about this enlightenment stuff? He says, here we have a problem. Faith and reason may not work so well together. Our belief in Christian dogma, those essential teachings of Christianity that make Christianity what it is, according to Kierkegaard, he says Christian dogma is offensive to reason because a lot of it doesn't make reasonable sense. The fact that Jesus Christ came and was incarnate is unreasonable. So we can either take offense and be so offended by that in our capabilities of rationality and reason that we reject it, or we can have faith. And he argues that God has set that up intentionally so that we are challenged by it for the purposes of inspiring faith. For Kierkegaard, the highest thing in our lives is the life of faith. Kant is pure reason. Everything accords, and orients itself around reason. For Kierkegaard, the end run of everything we do in this life is about faith. So in the aesthetic stage of existence, we don't employ, we don't exercise reason. We just want to make ourselves feel good. In the ethical stage, we start to think and practically process through and think, okay, well, it's better that I am obedient, which is reason. But on the other hand, when we get to the religious stage of existence, we understand that our choices, our consistent obedience out of the ethical becomes the habit of our lives that is the single most defining thing about our life and our faith and all the rest of it. And so then when we are confronted with things that seem contradictory, faith and reason perhaps, we can be offended or we can have faith.